Hey guys, welcome back to the Kings and Queens City podcast. Of course, this is Ed Pugh, and I'm here besides Mr. Taylor Pugh himself is bringing you our fourth. Taylor, are we on our fourth now?
We're on number 4.
Number 4. This is our fourth podcast. Taylor, what are we going to talk about today?
Today we're going to talk about tenants, and the reason we're on that subject this week, we were reminded about how important they are to our business, and as we go through it, one of our tenants passed away this week, and he'd been in some health conditions for a while, so it's probably a better place for him.
Yeah, and one of the things that stands out to us is how I think it is cliche to say, that your tenants become family to you. I don't necessarily think that, frankly, that's not sacred enough to the family relationships that you have, but they do become an integral part of who we are. We're interested in their best interest. We want to encourage them to be in a better place after their interactions with us than before. And so we definitely want to talk about that specifically today.
We for sure, I wouldn't use the word family either, but for sure are concerned about their well-being. And at the end of the day, we're providing a service, providing them a place to live, and they're paying us for that privilege. We really do care about them, and at the end of the day, their concerns become our concerns, and a lot of the things that they're worried about, we're worried about for them, because we want them to be successful in executing that lease. We want them to be successful in their life, and it's interesting how integral you become when you become someone's landlord.
Absolutely. I think there are a lot of surprises for the types of things that you start addressing once you become a landlord. There's all types of things that you never think you're going to deal with, all types of family dynamics you end up addressing, financial literacy. There's just a lot of things that go into being a successful landlord besides just fixing toilets and, replacing sinks and maintaining properties. And that's what brings us back to one of our tenants, which is our tenants, one of the cornerstones of our business, which is to provide safe, clean, affordable housing for our tenants. And we really do regard them as our key customers. We've really got a couple of key demographics or key customers that we serve, and one of those is definitely our tenants. Another one that we serve is, of course, our private money relationships. And in fact, the next episode, Taylor and I will be talking in detail about those dynamics.
Yeah, we won't go into that on this episode. Our tenants are really the core customer of our business. And when you're a landlord, you need to understand that they're your customers. So when they're not happy, I have challenging situations to deal with because my customers aren't being served properly.
Absolutely. And it's also a bit of a paradigm shift in that people should understand that when the tenants share with you that there's a problem in a unit, they're sharing with you that there's a problem in the assets that you're buying. And so it's really important to take most of those concerns seriously. Of course, Taylor, I think you and I were talking today as we were talking about prepping for this discussion. We were talking about some of the adventures we've had. The adventures we've had in landlord.
In landlord land?
Yeah, landlord land. Anyone who's seen Adventures in Babysitting, that might be a reference there. But
way to date yourself. Wait. Hey guys, Ed is clearly from the 80s because he referenced
Adventures in Babysitting.
Adventures in Babysitting in the podcast.
Absolutely. But Taylor, if I'm from the 80s, then when are you from?
We don't need to be
we need to move on from that.
For those concerned, me and Ed are twins, so you can just imply it from there.
That's absolutely right.
The adventures in landlording is extreme. We have recently switched over to a property manager, and so a lot of these concerns are no longer concerns that we're addressing on the daily basis. And anyone listening to this podcast, highly recommend you sooner than later jumping into that property management role where you have the team out there taking care of these issues, so you're not spending a whole day taking care of a toilet.
Absolutely. And one of the major things that we want to share with people here is if Taylor and I had implemented property management into our business sooner, we would be further along in our business today.
That's a guarantee.
Right. And so if you think about property management as an expense, it's really not that expensive for the amount of time that it frees up in our business.
We could classify that most of last year I spent being a property manager.
Absolutely.
Where my part in our business should be to grow the business, and last year I spent most of my time being a property manager. And as we do with each other and as you should do with your partners, when we sat down at the end of last year and looked at how do we better our next year, the very first issue that was decided was that we would bring that property management team on. In fact, we brought them on in December, if I remember, because we saw how detrimental it had been to completing our business cycles.
Absolutely. And so one of the takeaways we want to share today is definitely that having solid, effective property management in place is key for your business in real estate, and we strongly, strongly encourage it. But Taylor, maybe we can think about, what's one of our favorite experiences of being a landlord or least favorite experiences, depending on the context of how we talk about it.
We could share stories all day about adventures in landlording. There are many, many positives and great opportunities where we were able to serve people in a really inspiring way.
Well, I mean, Taylor, one of the things that directly comes to mind is, we've posted bail for tenants.
I didn't know if you were going to talk about that specific issue.
I mean, I don't mind. I don't want to go any further than that. But, we've posted bail for people. We've paid for groceries. We've bought Christmas presents. We've cleaned up when, vandalism happens, even if in one case they elicited the vandalism. It was someone giving retribution and they elicited vandalism, and we still came back and helped them out. We've replaced locks when tenants have broken up with significant others. And so there's a whole series of things in ways that we've served people, but those are probably the positive experiences of how we've been able to have a real positive effect on people. Can you think of one or two of the negatives though?
Yeah, the first one that pops to mind was me waking up one morning to something in the realm of 40 missed phone calls, which for me is fairly abnormal. And it was from...
32 would have been normal. Had I missed 32 calls, that would have been normal. But when I got to 40, that was really abnormal.
I woke up to 40 missed phone calls starting at about 2 in the morning through 6:30 a.m. One of our multifamily properties had somebody trespass onto our property and looking for somebody that had lived there before we took ownership and shot up a front door of one of our units. Now, in the landlord world, I'm in no way responsible for anything that happened there because there's no violation of my lease. I didn't do anything wrong. Somebody trespassed on our property.
Committed a crime.
You have this balancing act where you have to say, was there a violation of the lease? And that's where we come back to a lot, but you then have to be empathetic to the fact that we had scared tenants. And so as soon as we were aware of the situation, we had it straight out there, immediately rescheduled the whole day, went out there, made repairs as needed as quickly as possible, changed out locks for, I think, every unit on that property just for a comfort level. Hey, we don't know who might or might, even though we had already changed out locks, we changed out locks again, understanding, their safety and what we could do to make them feel more comfortable. For things that weren't even our fault, we incurred extra expense to try and make them feel more comfortable.
Absolutely. And I think part of what is central to that experience was how do we make sure that the tenants, our primary customers, feel secure and safe in their homes.
I think we also put up motion lights on 2 of the buildings that basically
face the street.
They had a shared driveway,
right? And
so coming up that main driveway, we installed motion lights. I don't believe that this is something that would have happened again because it was a specific person looking for somebody else. I had the privilege of, as I took over that property, evicting basically the drug dealer of the neighborhood, and actually he was really cool in the eviction process. We had him removed. Somebody came back looking for him. One of our other tenants ended up in a bad situation. And fortunately, we were able to make them feel as comfortable as possible and do everything within our power as landlords to help them feel safe.
Taylor, you touched on an important point there. Most of the stories that I think are going to be shared on this podcast are those tenants that we've placed or what we describe as inherited tenants.
It's amazing the difference that we have between our inherited tenants and tenants that we've placed.
And so just for context for the listener who's out there, what is an inherited tenant? What does that mean?
Sure. If somebody has a lease in place, whether the owner sells that property or not, that lease is still binding. It's binding on the new owner. So normally when we're buying rental property, there's already a lease in place for some period of time. We're required to keep that current tenant, as long as they pay, as long as they abide by the lease, in place.
And just a quick exception for folks. State law is going to vary on how long these leases are bound. So you definitely want to check with attorneys in your market, find out how long that those lease obligations may last after you take ownership. In many cases, this hasn't been a problem. I think the point is, every time we have had problems, it's an inherited tenant.
If I was to do like top 5 problem tenants we've ever had, they were all inherited. That's
Right.
100% right.
Yeah. Would I date myself again if I was like David Letterman? Top 10 reasons why you have problems with your tenants.
That might become a new section.
Number
of the podcast.
10. One thing is definitely when you're taking over a property, you definitely want to understand every individual lease. You need to specifically understand the lease. You need to have read every page of every lease.
We also utilize a tool. It's called an estoppel letter. It's something as a prospective buyer that you bring to the tenant. And what it says is the current amount they owe on rent, the amount they owe in arrears, if any, the amount of their security deposit. It'll also list any reported violations and if those are still outstanding problems to be fixed. This gives basically a transition from the current owner to the new owner and the tenant, so everyone's involved in the process and we all know exactly where that tenant stands. If you're not using estoppel letters as you're making these transitions, you end up in a case where when we didn't use it, okay, well, who paid security deposit? Is there security deposit in place? You know, the last landlord said I didn't have to pay rent for the first 80 days. These are all things that maybe we haven't come across personally, but we've heard stories of, and after the fact, after you've already completed that purchase, it's hard to go back and say, well, this is where we're at.
We've also had a lot of experience in the space that we work in, which is kind of mid-market multifamily. There's often not a lot of processes about documenting any type of rent credits or anything like that. And what we see is 2 specific things that happen in this area. And one is that tenants will be credited for something like, an example, a tenant receives a credit for doing quote-unquote lawn care, which, by the way, they never do that. It's a terrible trade. Pay for professional services in every case. But they'll do quote-unquote lawn care, and then they'll have gotten a $200 discount on their rent for every month that they've done it. Yet when you look at receipts and rent rolls, they're going to be underpaying by $200 a month, and it's hard to go back and document whether that money's actually owed or not.
We ended up with another inherited tenant that his basic role on the property was, in essence, to be the property manager. His job was to do rent collection. His job was to do landscaping services, pick up trash.
Record maintenance issues.
That specific individual has probably caused me more heartburn than any individual that I've dealt with in the real estate world total. He was getting free rent from the owners and then not completing any of his required tasks after receiving free rent.
In fact, it should be noted that his specific unit, the individual who's responsible for maintaining all other units on the property, was subject to code violations, and he never worked to resolve it.
Not one.
Not one.
He also had a wheelchair ramp up to his unit. The bottom layer of his wheelchair ramp was a carpet. I don't know what type of foundation you build a ramp on that you decide we should start the foundation of the ramp with carpet.
A lot of times when people are making these types of decisions where they're making trades in rent for these types of services, you end up making a bad trade. First, because the person probably isn't qualified in the trade that you're making. And second, you may not, and especially in this case in distance landlording, you may not have the right type of eyes on the property to really understand what's going on there. And so, you know, one of the things in the classification of what not to do with a tenant is definitely don't trade services for rent. And if you're going to do that, then the tenant should still make a payment in full for the rent, and then you give them they invoice you and you pay them back for services provided.
It's a big deal that you're crediting this individual $200 when in essence it's somewhere around $10,000 of value that you're really giving away by letting him cut his own grass.
Which also, this comes back, and Taylor, we talked about this, I think, on the last week's episode about cash flow. When people are using, even an example, they're using units as storage units. Another terrible trade-off. We see it all the time in almost every deal we evaluate, but it's a terrible trade-off.
You couldn't see me cringe as Ed said that on the podcast, but guys, when Ed starts talking about these people using storage units or offices.
We've seen them give units to managers as part of pay.
That's one. Not utilizing a laundry room properly.
Absolutely. Yep, we've seen that too. We've seen them put items in storage just because they have an organized storage space that they have on the property. Remember the one in Winston? And we went up there and they had a roll-up garage and it was actually a lot of space, but they just had boxes piled up in there. So then in their office, they had boxes piled up. So then they were using a third unit just so that they could actually have an office space to meet with tenants.
They also had, the roll-up garage wasn't full. The office was full of storage supplies.
That's right.
And the third usable unit was then being used as the office with the backup unit behind it that had fire damage that could have been repaired had they made the repairs to both of those units and then use the office and then put the storage unit supplies in the storage unit.
There's a lot of leapfrogging that had to happen there. It could have become a much better performing property had they done all the right things. And do you remember what the storage was, by the way? Trivia, do you remember what was in the boxes?
I think it was flooring.
It was flooring. So they wanted to save money on their flooring, so they took up, 4 units worth of flooring to save, how many hundreds of dollars in flooring a unit? What, $200?
To save $200, and that flooring had to be sitting there for months.
Years, probably. I mean, just a long time. Remember that fire damaged unit out there, it had been sitting out there for, what did he say, 2 years, 3 years? I mean, a long, long time.
Hey, let's circle back around onto tenants on this, though, because we were getting a little bit out there onto some property stuff. Guys, you're going to just see a lot of things that come across as a landlord. And again, if you have property management, you don't see any of this side of the equation. But something that we see a lot of is a lot of babysitting. You become a professional babysitter. I can't count the times that I've had, especially on our multifamily units, a tenant call me and say, I don't like so-and-so.
And by so-and-so, you mean, I don't like the person who lives 2 doors down from me. Or my child and the tenants 2 doors down, their child, have gotten into a disagreement. Please do something about it.
My child has had his bike misplaced by the tenant's child 3 doors down. And I literally have to step back and say, guys, I need you to look at the lease and then reference what part of the lease they're currently violating so I can enforce it. Well, it's not a lease item.
Then we're not responsible for it.
Okay, then I need you to call the police and report.
If a crime's been committed.
If a crime, well, in this case, like the bike being stolen, right?
Right.
I need you to call the police, and in this case, they back up to a police station. I need you to call the police and report that the bike is stolen. Oh, well, I'm just not going to do that.
I don't know how to fix this for you then.
Well, I don't like my neighbor, so don't talk to them.
Right. I mean, Taylor, on your street, you've got neighbors you don't, you know what I mean? Like, this just happens, and when you're a homeowner, you certainly don't call the HOA and complain, well, maybe they do. I don't know. You sat on the HOA board, you would know.
As a member of the HOA board, previously, you again are a babysitter.
Right.
What can the HOA do about speeding?
Yeah, but coming back to tenants, guys, it is about clearly understanding the landlord-tenant responsibilities. One thing we recommend is most states have minimum responsibilities for tenants, and it's very important that landlords clearly understand those specific items. Just an example of one of those elements, just to give you a flavor for it if you haven't understood this in the past. In North Carolina, landlords are required to provide heat in their units, but they're not required to provide AC. So just as an example, in other places, those could, potentially, I can't think of a place that this would make sense, but maybe in Arizona, there might be a requirement to provide AC and not heat.
We're also required to, make sure that things like smoke detectors are operational. And this is a big one, guys. Your tenants will remove smoke detectors all the time.
Absolutely.
Because they want to be able to smoke in their units, and they want to be able to do that without going out in the rain or standing on the porch. So when we were doing it, part of our biannual inspection was to make sure that we replaced the smoke detector batteries and that they were in place and we had pictures of that happening.
Filters is another one where we have it written into the lease where we can come in and change them every 3 months if we need to. And this gives us cause to go into the unit to make these informal inspections on some level of regularity, like every 3 months.
We have some tenants that are going to be very agreeable, and then, in fact, they're excited about you coming over because, for whatever reason, they like talking to you. And Most tenants seem to be agreeable. There are some tenants that are more private, and these inspections will be more complicated to schedule. In fact, in one occasion, we actually had a tenant deny allowing pest control folks in.
I remember.
And so I had to start the eviction process on them to encourage them to let my pest control people come in after they had complained about a pest issue. Now, our lease actually doesn't require us to do this, but again, it's the goodwill of we were able to get a great deal and do all of the units at one time, so that made sense to us.
Absolutely. And Taylor, I can think specifically about a tenant who, once we placed them in the unit, said, okay, great, thanks for the keys. And you're never going to come back in the unit, right? And you have to set expectations about, I have no interest in coming and bothering you in your home, but on occasion, my responsibility is to do some level of due diligence about how you're habiting this specific unit, and I need to ensure that we're doing some things along the way.
On that specific unit, we ended up refinancing the property, and me bringing in the inspector to do that refinance was very stressful to that individual.
Yeah. And it's just, some people, back to your point, Taylor, some people just live private lives. That specific guy, I mean, he kept his units pretty clean. There wasn't any concern that we had when we went in. He changed the filters. He kept the smoke detectors in place. So all these things that we normally look for, he was doing. He just is a private guy. He was a young guy, too. This is one of the first places he's had on his own.
I believe he paid rent to his parents. We had some pre-screening verification that had that. But he was just a really private guy. Didn't want anyone bothering him. Didn't want to be, as I understood in the previous area he was in, and loved that he was on a different part of town, different environment, different people, and was able to just come and go as he pleased without anyone interfering with him.
At his own personal private place. So Taylor, we've talked about some of our experiences, some of the good, some of the bad. But what are, when someone asks you out there, we network with a lot of people. When someone asks you, hey, what's a best practice? What are the things I need to be concerned about? What are your go-tos? Like, what do you share with people?
Yeah, the top one is, if possible, bring in a property manager. None of these issues would be things that I would have dealt with had I brought in a property manager early enough in the process. And I know I've already said in the episode like twice, I want to be very clear that you guys capture that specific message.
We know there are people out there who insist, no, I do a better job. Nobody takes care of your property like you take care of it. What do you tell those guys when they're self-managing?
Yeah, so the smaller self-managed guys that you have 10 or less units and you're insistent on you're going to save that 8%, you have to start with screening. I need you to get the full screening. I need you to get the eviction, the background check, the criminal check, the credit check. I need you to be doing it all the way across the board. We use a website called TVS, Tenant Verification Services. I'm going to try and put it in the show notes, so if your player allows that, make sure you check it out. I know for sure that iTunes will allow it, so if you're not on there, iTunes is obviously convenient.
So let's stay on that for a minute. So credit check comes back. Does price point matter on the credit check?
It does to some extent. Your lower end tenant is going to be working a minimum wage job. Steve Harvey likes to say, even if you have A1 credit, you're living paycheck to paycheck.
And it can be tough.
And so no matter what you're doing, you can't buy anything anyways. So credit is going to be a challenge of that lower end. We have one specific tenant that is on the higher end and works for a large bank in town. And his credit was not an issue in the slightest. In fact, it's probably one of the highest credit scores I've seen. Where our lower end tenants, they're not going to have the score.
And so sometimes in that case, we can offset with taking a security deposit. We can offset with documenting that they have the income requirements. Let's talk about criminal check, though, because that is one that comes up. What do you look for in a criminal check, and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable?
Yeah, for us, we're never going to rent with someone with a felony. In my personal opinion, this is how I think about it. The government has chosen that they don't have the right to vote. I'm okay with them not having the right to rent in my unit. Outside of that, you're going to see a lot of noise on a criminal background check. You're going to see things like speeding tickets or, something maybe when they were really young years ago. And what I normally do is I'll go back 5 years and look for something serious, a violent crime. You as a young teenager floating a check and not paying, and you ended up with some
fraud charge or
some floating a check charge or something, like, it's not going to be, especially on the lower end, I'm not going to be concerned about that, especially if it's been some time. So I'm going to go back, 3 to 5 years. I'm going to look at the cases. And if it's something more recent, I'm going to call the tenant and ask them about it.
We had a case one time where we called a tenant. It was a specific thing, and he shared with us the whole story about how he'd had a very bad relationship and how the family had kind of created a situation. And it's, it just takes some empathy and understanding. And so I think the point is you can be flexible on some of these guidelines, but you've got to have some lines on the sand where if it crosses, you've got to have a conversation with the tenant and really understand the issue. Share with them, just an example. Well, I had a possession of marijuana charge 7 years ago. Okay, understood. You're not allowed to bring any type of drug paraphernalia into our units. You need to understand that. I'm going to make you initial next to our clause in our lease that says that. But then we're going to go. I mean, we're going to get you a place to rent, and we're going to give you a place where your family can feel safe, and you can begin to move on from there.
Yeah, so for us, our hard place in the sand. I don't care about your driving record at all. It's not part of my agreement. So you'll see all sorts of like speeding and improper movement and whatever. Driving without insurance is really common at the lower end. So we see that, but that's not a concern to me. My concern is violent criminal history and a felony. So if I see those, and I would even rent to someone with a felony that had it 10 or 15 years ago.
Right. But
something more recent, it's just, and then it depends on the felony.
Depends on the charge. And so what I guess we're suggesting is you just really want to use some judgment of how you're doing this, but definitely using a service like what Taylor mentioned, the tenant verification services. They'll provide you a complete credit, criminal, and eviction background check, and the tenant pays for it directly through the website. It's super easy to use. The reports are very complete. So those are certainly services that we would suggest you use.
There's plenty of them out there, and we've used a couple of different ones. This one we found to be the best for us personally because all I had to do was send or type in their email address one time. It sent them the email, and then they did all the work on their side. And until I got the results back, I didn't have to do any additional work. So if they had halfway applied and then decided not to, I wasn't doing a bunch of type-in work for them not to fill out their credit card information.
And in fact, that website will show you where they stopped in the process. So did they open the email? Did they log on to the site? Did they enter their credit card information? Did they confirm their identity through items off of their credit report? So it's like every element, it shows you where it's at. So yeah, definitely a best practice there.
The only other thing I share with individuals is you need to become comfortable having uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah, and just for people out there who are kind of looking at Taylor and saying, well, Taylor, what do you mean by uncomfortable conversations? Taylor, you have to be able to have a conversation with someone that says, hey, you were on a 1-year lease. That lease has expired. We don't allow you to stay in a month-to-month tenancy. And so for you to stay in our unit, you're going to have to pay $50 more a month than you did last year.
Ed, you mentioned a good point about month-to-month tenancy. This is something we see really common as we take over units. We have what we call dated leases. They're leases they're 1-year leases that are 4, 5, 10 years old.
Sure.
Because they haven't been renewed. And this is a really clear indicator when you hear someone say, well, the rents haven't been raised in 10 years. That tells me off the bat that they do not have a current active lease. And in general...
they have a month-to-month lease. Technically, legally speaking, their tenancy is month-to-month based on the lease that's now 10 years old.
You're absolutely right. They have a dated lease, but they don't have a current active annual lease in place that has been updated. For most people, you're going to be using your standard state forms, and you can go on Google and find most of these. We use a lease that's basically double our standard state form length, and we have a lot of success with that. In your market, you should reach out for something specific. Please avoid at all costs the LegalZoom version, the I found online for free. Guys, go to your realtors, go to your lawyers, and get the official lease from them to be utilized in these formats.
At a minimum, use the official state lease that's often, in most of the states that we've seen, there's an official lease, whether it's sanctioned by the state bar or the state realtors association or something like that. There's often always a quote unquote official state lease, and we definitely suggest people use those forms. The second part of the uncomfortable conversations, Taylor, that you were talking about that comes to mind is you've got to hold people accountable to their lease. And so, are you knocking on the doors sometimes and telling people, look, your lease requires the payments made by the 1st. It's now the 6th. You're late, which means there's now a late fee. And if you don't pay by X date, here's notice that we will be initiating eviction processes. So if you're not comfortable having those conversations, you definitely need to have property management in place.
When I was the manager, me and Ed had a very specific dynamic where I was the good guy and he was the bad guy. And so to our tenant, you would perceive that Ed was a jerk. You would think that Taylor was the one that, even though I was handing you the eviction paperwork, I was still trying to work with you to get across the finish line.
Absolutely. And that's a bit about communication patterns and who's playing what role and who the audience is for what you're doing. I mean, at the end of the day, Taylor and I both had the same stated goal of operating an effective rental business. And so, at no point would his behavior be contrary to that, and at no point was my behavior contrary to that. Hey guys, with that, want to thank you for tuning in to listen to our conversation about tenants. Adventures in
Landlord Land?
Landlord Land. I like it. Guys, we want to thank you for joining us today. Definitely check us out on those socials. We're Kings in Queen City across Instagram, Facebook. That's our website as well. The podcast is obviously the Kings in Queen City. So definitely check us out.
We're also up there on YouTube, so if you follow our channel on YouTube, you can get notifications. I believe the podcast should now be streaming onto YouTube, so you can see us there as well.
Absolutely. And guys, that's just go onto YouTube, search for Kings in Queen City. Definitely subscribe. Once we reach a certain number of subscribers, we can flip that youtube.com address to something that's more manageable, and we can share it with you more directly. But appreciate you guys. We'll catch you real soon.